So what is metadata? Well, there's data and then there's metadata. So here's an example. You can see that's a picture of my dog, and then beside there is the metadata about my dog. So you've got the two different ideas into there. That in a nutshell is really what you want to know about data versus metadata, the thing versus the description of the thing. But of course, as you know, there's a lot more to it than that. Metadata is a hybrid word. It's a hybrid because the first part of it is actually Greek, and meta means after or beyond. But when you use it as a prefix, it means more comprehensive or transcending. So it's often used to describe something that's larger than the subject at hand. Data, on the other hand, is a Latin term, so we've actually got Latin and Greek put together, hence it's a hybrid word, which is a plural of datum or a data point. So a datum is one thing, data is the plural of it, and we tend to use the term data to mean a point of factual information that needs to be processed in order to be meaningful. So one datum or a piece of data does not give us a complete picture. We're not able to fully draw the information from it. It gives us an overview of that subject. When we put these two words together, we get metadata, which is information about information. It's the important data points that we want to attach to a document that helps to describe and give a description of that document. We first used that term in 1967 by MIT scientists who were describing the need for a digital meta language. But metadata is actually a lot closer to information management. It has a great deal of history before that. And we actually have experienced metadata before if you've ever been to a library, because metadata is used by information and library science to catalog and describe content. So we've all seen, if you're old enough to remember card catalogs that are within a library, they were a physical representation of metadata. So the cards, the library holdings could be found by title, author, or subject. Now, when I say holdings, we're not just talking about books. We're talking, back in the day, they'd have records, they might have newspaper clippings, they might have a file of different sort of information on things, and they would cross-reference this information by title, author, or subject. Those are conventional metadata fields. So if you've ever talked about a library piece of information, you're quite familiar with metadata fields already. But it's a limited process. If you were to add a new category of information, think about an entire library worth of books. If you want to catalog all of that with another card catalog, it's a tremendous amount of work to get the card catalog, fill out every one of the cards, and then also control it. So for instance, you could make a new catalog of media types, but who would ever use that? Would you ever go to a library and say, I want to start looking through the catalog of records to see what they have, and I'm going to start with the A's, and I'm going to go all the way to the Z's or the Z's, depending on what you prefer to use as a term. Does that make any practical sense for you as a user? When it comes to physical media, it doesn't. Now let's take that idea into something like a paper document. When we talk about metadata, the process of going through and tagging and referencing and putting information onto that is actually a lot more work than potentially it's worth. And so we often don't see that being used with paper, which is why pretty much every library has since now moved to a digital catalog, and it allows for an incredible variety of metadata. So here's an example of metadata from the New York Public Library for Andy Weir's novel, The Martian. So we can see a bunch of reference points of information. I pulled this off the website this morning, so you can see that these are the live text fields that have been put against this document. Now we can help to categorize this information that's into here. Let's take a look at our three most basic ones. We've got title, author, and subject. Now the first thing to point out is it is much easier to have multiple subjects for it. We might not consider this to be a Mars Planet book, Mars Planet fiction for sure, but we can tag it under Mars Planet. You can see that over here because it's quite legitimate to it. Astronauts, survival, survival fiction, etc. These are different categories, and we can have as many subject fields as makes sense for the document. Now we can go further with those descriptive pieces of information. We can do things like a summary. And by the way, this is just the first sentence. I cut out there's a very long paragraph, but I didn't think it was relevant to have it on screen. So I cut that out of this. And we also have our genres for it. We have different points of information that we want to put against the document for describing it by genre. Again, really good descriptive pieces of information. As it turns out, this is a class of metadata, which is called a descriptive metadata. Descriptive metadata is designed to describe the object in question, to give you a sense of what it's about. It puts it in context with other pieces of information potentially within a system. Now, you could argue with me that perhaps the title and the author may not be descriptive, maybe there are other points of metadata, and I believe you. Summary, subject, and genre are absolutely descriptive, and there is no absolute value to that. You could say quite legitimately that why is science fiction on there twice? It shouldn't be. We should only have one of them. That's a database entry error, and I would say you're absolutely right. That should be corrected. But this is an example of what we can use to help classify and control this information. Now we've got other points on here. We've got publisher, the edition, the LCCN, the ISBN. These are identifying numbers that are used within a system. So for example, New York Broadway Books 2016 as the publisher is a fixed point of information to it. This therefore becomes what we would call administrative metadata. It describes the information from an administrative point of view. These are the things that don't change towards it. Now they can describe the information, but not in a meaningful way. Nobody who sees LCCN 2016229025, yes, we know that there's coding that's involved with that, but we're not getting the same value of that coding as we might with some of the other forms of information. So usually when it comes to administrative metadata, sometimes it's over top of sort of descriptive use and more about putting unique identifiers or other pieces of information that are only found for that. We also have the advantage with administrative metadata of getting to describe things. And because of that, we could quite definitely classify the title and the author as additional fields of administrative metadata. We don't need to only have one category. A piece of metadata can exist as both descriptive and administrative metadata. And of course, we have some other points onto here, which are the last four fields: description, type of content, type of medium, type of character. We would call this structural metadata. This is information about the document's content. So we can consider something like, we take a look at the page count on this, 383 pages. That's not an arbitrary number. That's a number that's been created because of the size of the font, the number of blank pages that they put into their sizes of maps they may have put in, and that other content will affect what the total number of pages is. But the title and the author remain consistent version to version. So if this was a large font version of the book, then we might see a lot more pages into it. We'd also see, however, the title and the author remain the same, but the publisher might be different, the ISBN might be different. It depends on what information we need to tag to these. So metadata, whether it's descriptive, administrative, or structural, can change depending on version or can remain consistent depending on what it's attempting to describe. Now, metadata in FileHold is stored in sort of, two different ways. And if you've used FileHold, you'll probably be familiar with this. Over on the left, we've got our metadata fields. These are the ones that are your description for them. So when you create a schema for a document and you apply metadata for them, these are your types of fields of information you're putting onto here. The second half, which I've just done to make it fit onto the one screen in a large enough size to be able to read, we can see our summary, and that is your version information or your file property information. Version property information is more specifically how FileHold refers to it. And again, we're using a lot of those same logic that we were before. So I've got 4 fields over here that function as descriptive metadata. These are your fields that you've tagged to it. So you can put in whatever content you want for that. There's nothing about the document that says that this must be from Acme Co. It's what's been assigned to the document. We understand that the metadata when we're looking at it is Acme Co, but there's nothing in the document that would force you to use Acme Co. It's a decision that you've made, hence it's a piece of descriptive metadata for it. That's very different than the administrative metadata that FileHold controls. Every document must have a name. This is the name. Therefore, that is a non-interpreted piece of information. Same with the owner, library location, when it's going to be deleted by a retention policy, etc. These are all things that FileHold is describing. One of the biggest differences is that in FileHold, if I was to click on the screen, I could edit my descriptive metadata. I cannot edit my administrative metadata directly. So for example, this is version 1 of 1. I can't go into that field and change it. I could check the document out, check it back in as a new version, and it would become a new version of that document. We'd then go to 2 of 2 if I was looking at it, and this then would be 1 of 2 from my original document. We all understand that. I haven't actually changed those numbers directly. I've changed the document, and therefore the administrative metadata changes with it. So when we're talking about admin metadata, we are definitely talking about higher function. Now the structural metadata is a lot more limited here. We're talking about format, size, and the type of file. Now I've also put the document schema there as a structural piece of metadata because so much else depends on it that it helps to define what kind of document it is. And we're talking about kind, or more talking about structure than anything else. But you could easily argue with me that the document schema is descriptive, and I wouldn't argue with you. I'm more just saying that this is some examples of how we can use that. Now, you might be making descriptive metadata that functions as structural metadata, number of pages in document. FileHold's not controlling that. You are controlling that when you put the document in, but you're using that as structure towards the document. So if we were adding the Martian into here, we'd make sure that we'd have a metadata field for the number of pages on the document. So how much metadata should you have? It's a very common question that we get asked. The good news is that FileHold supports up to 200 fields of metadata per schema. So each schema can have 200 fields of metadata. Do not have 200 fields of metadata on your schema because you will go crazy with that. That is a lot of metadata. But we can talk about what metadata can be used for and use that as a guide for what we should have on it. So we can use metadata to classify. We can help to distinguish this from that, invertebrates from vertebrates in this case, for example, the two different scales of how we'd classify. We can use it to organize. We can put like with like. We can use it to help identify similar things. We can locate. We can use it to map and find documents within the system. I'm looking for invoices. That's a schema. I'm looking for invoice from company X. That's a metadata field. Helps me locate those. We can file them. FileHold has an auto-filing rule that can be applied against a document, so we can use the metadata to determine where the document's going to live in the system. Without that, the user would have to manually put the document into there, and that saves a lot of work. We can use it to index. We can find pieces of information and tag it into there to make sure they can be classified for later. So just like a table of contents in the back of a book, you can use them as the terms to hook or find that information later. We can use it to assemble. We can gather different documents together, put them into one place, and make sure that we can apply them. We can describe the document. We can use language that makes sense within your organization, so you can use nomenclature to describe something. You can tag documents with information. You can make sure that the key terms that you need to know have been applied to the document. We can control the document. We can determine what its limits are, what its higher, lower limits are. We can also use it to apply against, so for instance, we often say with control, if I've got an invoice and it's over a certain amount, it's going to be this kind of schema because I'm not allowed to enter a value into that that's beyond that. We can use it to retain. You can put retention schedules against the documents so that they're only held for a length of time until they're finally disposed of, and we can use that information to help retain those documents as part of your system. And we can also use this to communicate. Now, oftentimes we were talking about FileHold, we're talking about a limited use of the system only in the sense that we're talking about this for FileHold users. But we have a format called XML, and if you've ever used Manage Imports, you'll probably seen XML before. It's actually a way of transporting metadata from one system to another. So I can send a document to another system, and if it can read the XML, if it's been set up to interpret that information, it will bring that document in without a concern. So I can actually use it to communicate not just specific details, but general details about a document. So it's a very powerful feature there. So the answer to how much metadata should I have? You can have as many fields as you need, but not more than are a burden to manage. If you don't need a page count on your documents, if that's not important to your operating, to your functioning as an organization, then please don't build that metadata field. It's possible, but it may not be required. So have as many fields as you need, but not more than are a burden to manage. So some other key metadata concepts. I'm just going to introduce some of these quickly. So one of them is a unique identifier. I mentioned this earlier. And a unique identifier is metadata that describes only one document or record. So it's a unique piece of information that helps me locate that particular item. Now I've used an example of an invoice number here, and somebody who's keen might say, but invoices might be coming in from other organizations. There's a chance that two documents could have the same piece of information. That's absolutely correct. But if you had a vendor, for example, if I was to use the vendor name and an invoice number, those two fields together would become an absolute unique identifier because that company will not be sending two invoices of the same number, or they have horrible accounting practices, which could exist, but let's assume that they don't. So a unique identifier is a way of finding that one document, finding that needle in the haystack. A common metadata field. You'll see this within FileHold's documents. This is a field that's used in more than one schema, so we can find multiple pieces of information and put them together. And my classic example of this is a purchase order number. So if I have a purchase order number, it could exist on the PO, it could exist on the invoice, on the bill of lading, it could exist within the any custom work projects was put together. That PO number can move between different document types, and a common metadata field lets me gather those documents together. One of the most powerful tools that we have is a common metadata field because it lets me find like with like. show me everything from the Acme company, and I can bring all that information together. Controlled vocabulary. This is a pure information management term. These are where you're giving people the options to choose from and not allowing them to enter free text. And you can see the example there are different colors. I can only choose from those colors. If I had a different color into there, if I had black, I wouldn't be able to enter it because it's not one of my selections that I can make against that list. So I'm saying that this is the ones you have to use. This is particularly powerful with things like a vendor list because I want the difference between Coca-Cola versus Coca-Cola Bottling Company, comma, the. I may have a different name for them and I want people to use the name that I'm giving them. Now this is another pure information phrase and it's called taxonomy. And taxonomy is terminology and classification scheme used by an organization. So it's what you've decided to do. And when I say organization, that could also be a professional organization. It could be an entire industry. Anything that becomes the classification scheme for what we understand information to be gathered as. This is a top-down way of dealing with it. I'm giving you the taxonomy and you apply the taxonomy. Now, something that's come up in the last, I'd say, 20 years is the idea of a folksonomy. And a folksonomy is a terminology or classification scheme created by the users of the organization, and it's a bottom-up approach to it. We're going to look at that again in a moment, but I wanted to introduce the term here just so we can have it in our list of metadata concepts. All right, enough preamble. Let's get into some tips and tricks. Now, some of these things may be materials that you've seen before, but I want to make sure that you get a chance to see them. There's a lot of different things metadata can do, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to see what they are. First thing I'm going to do is use metadata for file names. An underutilized tool. I think it's absolutely essential, so we're going to cover that. We're also going to take a quick look at database lookups. We won't be dealing with the setup of them, but if you've never seen a database lookup, here's an opportunity to see how that works in action. We're going to look at metadata to create folksonomy tags. So we're going to use those to create that bottom-up set of language that we can use to control information. We're going to use clear-it check-in to capture version changes between documents so that we can see what it's like as you update documents through and force people to make changes onto them. We're going to look at grouping metadata in views, which again, if you're not using custom views, we've done a video on that before. I just want to touch on grouping because it's a great way to cluster information together and make like appear with like on screen. It's a very simple tool to use. And we're also going to look at mass edit for metadata on entry. Again, something I don't think enough people see, but I see too many people when I'm doing training sessions manually entering common information on multiple documents at once. Let's take a look at some ways that we can avoid that. All right, so with that preamble out of the way, let's take a dive into FileHold. We're going to start off with the renaming function. So let's open up our desktop application. You can see I've been doing some work in here before. And we're going to go up to our administration panel, and we're going to start off with taking a look at our document schemas. And we're going to take a look at our AP invoices, because this is one of the ones that I always use for renaming. So you'll know that there's a tab over here called renaming. When I click onto that, if it's been enabled, then I can automatically rename my documents using the metadata fields. In my case, I want to have a prefix of INV, and then I want to have the invoice number, the vendor, and the invoice date. And I've also put a mask on the field over here. And if you've not seen these before, this is very cool. You may know that when you create document types, let's use our standard US-based convention for naming, it will put slashes in between them for its default short date format. And the problem is slashes in a file name will not be read. So I'm doing this on March 23rd, 2023. So the format would come across, instead of being 0803 2023 with a slash in between them, it would just be a string of numbers. It'd be 8 characters together, and that can become very confusing. So to avoid that, we can change this so that instead of that, we'll put dashes. So we'll do, we could do MM, by the way, capital M for month, lowercase m is minutes when you're dealing with a date mask. And then we can put a dash in between it, and then we can put our Ys. So we can put our separators into there, or we could lose those, or we could say, you know what, I don't care about the month or the day, I just care about the year. So I can take the existing invoice date and I could mask it off to just Ys. Whatever you want in the file name. This does not overwrite the metadata field. That remains consistent with on the document. So we haven't changed anything, we're just changing how it's being presented. And then when I hit refresh, it shows me what that naming pattern would look like. So that's how we can apply a custom naming pattern to a document. Let's see that in practicality. So I'm going to cancel that. We're going to close this, and I'm going to go over to my managed imports. And we're going to take a look at our invoices, and we can see that I've got my invoices being mapped. I've got this turned off, so there's no automation happening. I've got my fields mapped through for the invoice number, and I've got my auto filing turned off. So what I'm doing is I'm going to take a document that's going to come in from an external source. In this case, it's going to be SmartSoft Capture. So if you've not seen that before, here's an example of SmartSoft Capture where I have an invoice. I've read the metadata for it, and I can come through this and make sure everything's good. So I can say, yes, this is approved, and yes, this is approved, and I've got my different values applied to it. And when I'm happy with this, we got a check mark, and I can hit export. So it pushes the document out of here. I can come back over to FileHold. I can run my managed import, and then I can go up to my inbox, and here's my document. Now that's my document name. Definitely not something I want to have in FileHold. So we're going to just drag this into the folder. I could use an auto filing rule at this point. I could do lots of other processing, but I'm just doing this manually for the purposes of our demo. And now I can select my document and send it. And when I go back down to my folder, there's my document with my renamed name in here. So INV underscore the invoice number, which is our unique identifier. So if I need to find this document again, I can find it with the 1085-2 and bring that over quickly. The name and then the date on the end of it with my dashes in between, because that's how I saved it against my formatting into there. So no manual naming of documents in that process. If in your organization you have people who are, meticulously going through and making sure their file names are correct, they're spending a lot more energy than they probably need to, especially if you use the metadata function. Then they can make that information searchable, organizable, all those things we talked about before. Plus, it can have the name put against the document, so you don't have to worry about manually naming anything. So renaming documents, very powerful function. Please make sure you consider it. The next thing I want to look at is lookups. So we're going to start this by coming up to our administration again, and we're going to take a look, first of all, at a metadata field. A metadata field in this case is going to be my invoice numbers. Now, I've got a couple of different invoice names in here, but I'm going to use this invoice numbers one, which is used as a database lookup. So you can see the field type here has been defined as database lookup. I can go to the field properties, and I can see that this is connected right now to a database. Now, please don't ask me about this part of it. This isn't part of what we cover in training. There's information that we have on our help page. So if you click up to here, that'll take you over to our help index, and it'll give you some information about how to set this up. You may need to ask for a custom query connection. That's a free license that you can get. If you have any questions about that, please reach out to either support or our sales team. We can connect with a SQL database out of the box. If you have a non-SQL database, you might need the special connector. That's a free license, so we're absolutely happy to give that to you, but it's not directly supported. So if you have any issues with connecting, we're not able to help you out with that. Hope that makes sense for you. It's just, this is not that it's not supported, it's that database configuration is not part of our standard license agreement. We don't deal with database connections. We don't deal with database setups. We do deal with FileHold. So if you've got your database connector done and you're still having issues, please let us know. We're happy to help out. But you can see what this is going to do is it's going to read into this database, so sales totals by amount, and it's going to read the order ID number off that. That's what we're using as the invoice number because that's the balance against our other database. So then when it comes to our document, let's go over to our schema, and we're going to go to our historic invoices type. Because again, these are old invoices that I'm scanning either for retention policies or for any reason like that. I'm bringing them into the system, I'm tagging them with information, I'm storing them against the software. So I'm going to use my historic fields, which is going to employ database lookups to do this. So under my metadata fields, we can see that I've got, and let's expand that, I've got my drop-down database lookup set up for my invoice number. Now I could have done the same thing for my customer name or my invoice date or my total, but I decided not to. Instead, what I decided to do was a lookup. So this is the second half of it. So our first half is the database lookup on the metadata field, and I can also do database lookup on the schema, where I can say, add the company name, ship date, and sale number to using the invoice number metadata field. So wherever you see one, you see the other, and it lets me bring that information across. So you'll see before I was using Capture and I was using this invoice from Rattlesnake Canyon. Now, if I go back over here to FileHold, let's cancel this out. And we'll go back over to our inbox, and we've got our sample Rattlesnake invoice sitting in here. So now I can set the metadata for this document. and now I can type in what I want to here. So first of all, I need to define what its field type is. It's an AP invoice historic. We know that for its type. And now I can put in its number. Now you'll notice here that this is a text field, but it's a text field built into a dropdown. And this list is being read from that database. So this is a list that's been imported into FileHold and now lets me type information in. So when I type a 1, it's going to only constrain this to show me values that start with a 1. If I type a 0, then it drops down only anything that's got a 0. So we can see that as I scroll down, my list of scroll will get shorter. So when we go 1, 0, 8, and again, my list gets shorter, 5, and my list gets shorter, 2, because that's the number, and we have that now completed. So we've got our invoice number into there. This eliminates the problem of keying in the wrong information. If I tried to type in this value, let's go to the end here, backspace off that, and try to enter a 3, it's not going to let me because there's no values that match that. I need something that's going to be a 2, and it lets me select that. So it stops me from entering in the wrong information. This is controlled vocabulary in action. This is me saying, here's a list, you choose from the list, or you don't get to enter the metadata against it. And because, you'll see the asterisk up here, this is a required metadata field, I can't bypass this. So I can only use an invoice number that's already in the system. And if I have a document that has the wrong invoice number, I may have found a missing invoice from the system. That's very valuable information for me to know. Now, that's all the data entry I need to do because now I can use that second part of it, the lookup. So when I click this, it automatically populates the customer name, the invoice date, and the total, and applies it against the document's metadata from the database. So I haven't had to do any further work. So now if I wanted to, I could save this. And you see right now it's called sample rattlesnake invoice. So let's drag this and drop it into my folder. And I can click and I can send. And it's gone from the inbox, and I go down to my folder, and there's my document with, again, a different naming convention because I applied a different set of rules to this one to say, I want different information on this than what I have for other systems. So again, another example of bringing information in, using those database lookups, and making my life easier. I'm also making my life more accurate. Here's one of the things I always say about metadata. Metadata is binary. It's correct or it's incorrect. It can't be a little bit correct. It can't be mostly correct. So anytime we use a controlled vocabulary, anytime we use a database lookup, we are ensuring that the information that's going against this document is consistent throughout the system. So if I'm looking for Coca-Cola Bottling Company, that's what I use to look for it. I don't use Coke. I can use the term that makes the most sense for me to find the information that I need. All right. Let's move on to our next one, which is the idea of folksonomy. So I want to show this. Now, I wanted to show this because I've dealt with a few companies that were dealing with archives. And one of the companies is actually a municipality, had a bunch of photographs that had been digitized, and they needed to add them into the system. And they were trying to figure out how they could locate them. And we talked about using a database lookup for that. But actually what it turns out is they don't need a database lookup. They need a FileHold managed lookup that they can add information to. So let's take a look. I go up here to my inbox, and I've got a stock photo over here. Now this is from a website, so I just pulled this off of the Dreamstime website. And we can see here's my image, and I've got 2 people in it, and we could use whatever terms we want to. Now you can see that they've done a bunch of tags down here to help describe this. So they've got business, people, meeting, professional, etc. So they've done a few tags on this document already. So what I've done is I've gone into FileHold and I've said, I want to bring this stock photo in. I might be using this in a campaign. So we've decided that if we're going to use this in a campaign, I want to tag this so I can find it later. So we can click on our set metadata. We can choose our document type, which in this case is, what am I calling? Oh, I'm calling this stock photos. That's right. We didn't get creative with that. So I'm going to go down to my stock photos. And now I've got campaigns used in, so I could say FileHold promo. And my image description for this has people talking business casual. These are the terms that I applied against this document. Now I can bring this document in, and then I can go back into this field and I can update this. So I can select these 3, and I can say save to that. That saves my information to it. And again, we can put this over here to our folder, and then we can select this and we can send it into the system. All right, so off it's gone. We come over here to our folder. Here's our document, stock photo, people talking business casual. So my terms that I put there against my folksonomy is in this. Let's go back and take a look at this image and say that, we want to look at this and we say, you know what, this looks like we want to use this as part of our campaign for mansplaining, because that's what this is going to be, okay? So we got a new folksonomy term that we want to put against this document. So we're going to go over to our library configuration, metadata fields, and then because I'm a library administrator, at least, I can go into my image description document type. So let's find that image description, and then go into my field properties, and we can add mansplaining, and we're going to add that into there, and then we're going to now say, okay. Now that doesn't apply this against the document. It simply means that now if I close this out and go into edit, I've got mansplaining now as an option, and I can choose that, and now I can apply that against the document, and it updates the file name immediately. Now, the big advantage of the folksonomy is that we can use the terms that make sense. The downside of it is that if you make a spelling mistake like I did, then that's going to translate onto the documents. So folksonomies are great for capturing information that people are using. They're really bad because they're uncontrolled information. So we want to use these with some caution, but generally speaking, they're a super powerful tool to be able to apply against a document. This is especially important if you have common terms you might want to apply to things. And again, I'm thinking of that organization I was working with where they had, photos of old houses, and then they had some that were black and white. They had some that were colorized. So B and W became one term, and then colorized became another, so they could simply apply them against the document. In their case, they weren't using them for names, they were just using them for the searchability for it. So folksonomy, powerful tool, probably better if you're a better speller than I am, but at least it's a tool that you can use in the box. All right. Next thing I want to take a look at is version changes. So here we have a document that we are currently in version 1 of it with some information, notes, added information to page 1. So clearly when someone added this in, they made a change to this. So if I was to check this document out, which I'll do right now, so we're going to check this out, and then I go in and I make an edit to it. Let's assume I've done that so I'm not spending time in the demo making a change to this. So we're going to check this document back in now that I've made a change. Now, before I do that, I want to show you what's happening for the settings of this. So this is an HR policy document. Let's go into our schemas for this. Go to our H and choose our policy documents. Under our metadata fields, we have this notes field that's available in here, and we've got clear at check-in selected. So if I check this document out, it's going to wipe out that field for me. I'm going to do one other thing here. I'm going to make that a required field. So now I can't have that as a blank field. This is why that's important. I'm going to apply this, and we're going to say OK, and I'm going to close that out. So now if I go into my document, and we are going to check this document back in, and let's just go ahead and try to do a check-in on this. It clears this field, because remember it said, added notes to page 1. That's been gone now. So now I can say for demo showing version changes. And I have to put a value into this because it's an asterisk. Let me just clear that. If I try to save this, it stops me from doing it because missing value for field for date added. So let's put that in here for the date added. Let's say it was today, and we'll try saving that again. Missing for reviewed by. Wow, I've got lots of information here I need to complete. So let's do that one, and let's save it again. Missing field for notes. So now I need to put my notes onto this. So I put my notes back in, and I save it. And now I've updated my document. We're at version 2, and I've got my notes appearing onto here. So required fields force people to make sure they enter information. Clear at check-in, make sure the information they're putting in is germane to the version in place. Now we're often asked about that, but what happens if it's the first version of a document and it's coming in, we don't have any changes that have been made to it. There's really no notes for it at this point. Feel free to put a default value into it of something like initial version. Then at least your document is tagged, you've got some information to it, people know it's an initial version, and you're good to move on from there. So that's our way that we can track our version changes coming through. All right. Next thing we have into here I want to show you is metadata grouping within views. And this is fairly simple, but again, it's something I don't know if everyone knows about. So I'm just going to go over here to my 2020 invoices folder, and I've got my different invoices from different companies. Now I can organize these by customer name if I want to, so I can see them grouped together, but it doesn't give me the same thing as seeing things specifically. Like for example, I can see these invoices numbered against each other, but I may want to see others. So to do that, I can right click onto this and go to group by, and I can choose a field that I want to group by. So in this case, I'm going to choose the, let's do the customer name. So now it groups everything together so that I'm actually clustered into these. So I can see these separated, and it much more helps me to see documents that are together like I can here. So unlike reordering them, because now what I could do is I could say, I want to see these in order of date. So if I click this, it reorganizes everything by date, but keeps the groupings together. So now I'm not seeing them by invoice number, I'm seeing them by their date number. So if you're not using custom views, I highly recommend that you look at that. Every full user can create custom views. You can right click onto here and go to your reorder columns, and that'll open this up, and you can create a custom view that matches what you're doing with your documents, and then you can apply a grouping to it if you want to, and that grouping will help to control the documents and put like with like. All right, one more thing to show you today, and I'm going to go back up to my inbox for this, and this is again something I often see people doing, is entering metadata one by one. So here I've got multiple documents in the inbox, and we've got an SOP, so standard operating procedure, and in this case I have documents that have some common metadata between them. So rather than choosing those values for each of them, I can select all of my documents, and now I can edit their metadata together. By the way, the buttons up here will affect everything that I have multiply selected. So if I was to choose edit destination, this would choose the destination for all of those documents. So I can put them into the folder, and that assigns it. If, on the other hand, I click on the set metadata, I'm only doing that for one document. That's not what I want to do here. I want to make sure I've got all my documents selected, and then I'm going to choose the edit metadata. And this is what's going to come up. And this is a very different view than what you're seeing when you're normally editing metadata, because I first have to define the schema, and then it's going to ask me what I want to do to them. So in this case, I know these are all going to be SOPs. So I'm just going to scroll down over to here, and we're going to choose our SOP document type. And now this appears with checkboxes in front of it. Here's why this is important. My EPA classification and transmittal number may be different, but the approval dates, review dates, area of domain, approved by, and the client name might be consistent. So we're going to choose all of these, but we're going to leave these blank, and then we're going to select a file to load them from. Because I only have one document that has its metadata defined, which is my test doc 1, I'm going to select that, and now I can click load. And that's going to load up those fields that have been checked. And now I can deselect my transmittal and my EPA because I don't actually want to save those against the document, and I can click save onto that. Now I still have info required on this, and that's because if I open up the metadata field for it, we can see I still need my EPA classification and I still need my CIO transmittal number, but the other common fields have been applied to this document. So rather than having to go through and define each of those per document, I can define them for one and then apply them to the others. I could have also done that by selecting all the documents and doing a mass edit and just entering those fields against the 3 documents. The advantage here is I've got 3 documents, I can keep these into the system. So it allows me to apply that. When I have multiple documents coming in, mass editing the metadata upon entry, it's definitely the easiest way to get this across. I've certainly got a couple more things I need to do to this, but once I've done that, I can bring it in. It's a lot easier for me to apply the metadata to the multiple fields at once than it is for me to do it 3 times over. You can imagine doing the same thing again for 50 documents in a pile. Got a bunch of common fields, apply them all at once, and it can only be the ones that I want. You may also be curious, what about if I'm dealing with common metadata fields? I can have different schema, but apply a common metadata field to multiple documents. So it's a very easy way to do that. I just have to choose what each of those. So if I was say, this is an invoice and this is a purchase order number and this is a bill of lading, then I could select all 3 of them and assign one PO number to all 3 of those documents. But it doesn't change the schemas because I'm applying the one metadata field in a mass edit tool. Same thing with the checkboxes before.